Hello, I'm Peter Dixon and I'm a reader in the parish of Croxton with Hollington in the Diocese of Lichfield. This is the first of 4 talks that I'll be sharing online about the life and works of Francis of Assisi. Francis is probably the Western Church's most best-loved saint, the man who was kind to animals and who is the patron saint of ecology. Paintings and statues often depict him with birds sitting on his shoulder and wild animals at his feet. Most garden centres sell bird baths based on a statue of Francis. Was there more to Francis than kindness to animals? Are we doing him an injustice if we define him simply as a sugary sweet animal lover? In these talks I shall be exploring the life of Francis of Assisi and revealing how in his 20-odd years of ministry he formed a new vision of God and his creation, founded one of the great religious orders, and was the focus of a colossal religious revival throughout Europe, which restored the fortunes of a flagging church. Given these achievements, it's not surprising that the Pope declared him to be a saint within 2 years of his death and ordered a detailed biography to be written by Thomas of Celano. That's how we know so much about him. That book will be hard reading for most of us, but there is also a delightful short book called The Little Flowers of St. Francis, which is still in print, and which is a collection of anecdotes, some of them perhaps a little fanciful, but which give perfectly the flavour of what made this remarkable person tick. That book is a must for everyone's bookshelf. Francis was born in 1182 in Assisi, which is in Umbria in Italy. Richard the Lionheart was on the throne of England, and Europe was under the feudal system. In that economy, society was divided into 3 levels. At the top were those who fight, the kings, the nobles, and the knights. They were first and foremost warriors trained for warfare from the age of 6. Second came those who pray, the clergy, the monks, and the nuns. And lastly, well, that's everybody else, those who do all the work, i.e. the ordinary people, from farmers and villeins to shopkeepers, millers and blacksmiths. But a 4th class was emerging in the 12th century, the merchants, those who buy and sell wholesale, import and export, and who became very wealthy as a result. Francis' father was one of those, Pietro Bernardon, importer and exporter of fine cloth between Italy and southern France. He was a coarse, violent man who had dragged himself up with his bootstraps. He was obsessed with possessions and the making of money. His wife Pica was from Provence in France, and French was spoken at home more than Italian. Francis was their only child, and he spoke French fluently, and he knew all the latest pop songs, which in those days were in French. He loved to sing them to his friends, and because of this, he got the nickname Francesco, which it translates in English roughly as Frenchy. He was actually called Giovanni. Francis is just an English version of his nickname, Francesco. And everybody today who is called Francis derives their name from the saint's nickname. Francis was rather short and wiry and not at all good looking, but he did have a sparkling personality. And now this is an extract from a fresco painted shortly after his death by the artist Giovanni, which is found around the ceiling of the church which is dedicated to St. Francis in Assisi. Not a very good looking man, rather thin, rather wiry, and a bit of a pixie sort of face, but that's what he looked like. He was a natural leader, and during his teens he would lead his friends in nights out on the town with wine, women and song. He enjoyed the family business and would go with his father to France on business trips. And like his father, he enjoyed the money that came from the business and the luxuries it could buy. He lived in an age of chivalry and longed to be a knight in shining armour and to marry a great lady. Now, Italy was not a single country at that time, and each city was its own sovereign state. In his late teens, the city of Assisi had a trade dispute with neighbouring Perugia, and they decided to settle the matter in battle. Francis' father bought him a suit of armour, and he excitedly rode to battle on behalf of Assisi, thinking it was all going to be a great jolly. All the fighting went against them, and Francis, with many others, was captured and held in a dark dungeon for a year. Yet even there he kept everyone's spirits up with his cheerful leadership and singing. Finally, the prisoners were ransomed and returned home, but Francis had caught a fever in the last days, which had him fighting for his life for weeks. It took him a year to recover, and when he finally rose from his sick bed, he was a changed man. And I wonder how many who have survived this COVID-19 disease will testify how a brush with death has changed their outlook. He lost interest in the family business and became very fervent in his faith. He would go off walking on his own for hours on end, lost in thought and prayer. Reflecting perhaps on how the battle with Perugia and his lost year in a dungeon, subsequent illness and brush with death were all the result of a dispute over money and the rights of possession. He came to see the truth of St. Paul's saying that the love of money is the root of all evil. From that moment on, he began to despise money, wealth and power. In the autumn of 1204, Francis was in the habit of going off to pray alone in San Damiano's, a derelict church just outside Assisi. The roof had fallen in, some of the walls were broken down, but there was still the old painted wooden crucifix above the altar, showing Christ on the cross with various of the apostles around him. And it's the same, this is a replica of that cross, if I can get it where the sun doesn't shine too much on it. There. And you can see the figure of Christ in the centre and all the way around, across the top and around the sides and down here, are all the figures from the crucifixion seen in the Bible. Hope that stays up. The original of that cross is still in Assisi. The Poor Clares have it, and they moved it about 100 years ago to their new convent in Assisi. As he gazed in prayer at the cross, Francis saw and heard the painted figure of Christ speak to him, saying, "Go, rebuild my church, which as you can see is falling into ruins." At first, Francis thought this meant he was to work to restore derelict churches, and he set about restoring San Damiano where he had seen the vision. Having no money of his own, he stole cloth from his father's warehouse and sold it to buy building materials. His father was furious, and this was one of the causes of friction between them. Francis clashed with his father over the values of his Christian faith, which were in complete opposition to the values of his grasping merchant father. His father gave him some serious beatings, but it changed nothing. He even locked him in the cellar for weeks, but Francis wouldn't budge. Matters came to a head one day in early 1205, when after another row, his father publicly dragged him before the Bishop of Assisi, demanding that the bishop forbid his son to be so stupidly religious. Not surprisingly, the bishop didn't feel able to grant that request. It was obvious that they couldn't go on like this. They were both stubborn as mules, and something had to give. So there and then, Francis stripped himself stark naked in front of the bishop and his father and all the astonished onlookers. He neatly folded up his clothes, handed them back to his father, saying, "From now on I will no longer say, my father Pietro Bernardone, but only, my Father which art in heaven." This was a very public and painful break with his family. They were never reconciled. Everyone thought Francis had gone mad, and his father was crushed by the shame of it. But it was necessary if Francis was to be true to Jesus' teaching that you cannot serve God and mammon. Francis' father would not be converted, so Francis had to choose. He chose the way of Christ, beginning a new life from that moment, and he never looked back. There's no record that he ever saw his parents again, or that they were ever reconciled, even though Francis was based in the area around Assisi all his life, and even though Francis, in due course, won fame and praise throughout the world for the work he was doing in the church. From that day in 1205, Francis began a new life of voluntary poverty as a hermit and a restorer of derelict churches. But this only lasted until February 1208, when God revealed to him the deeper meaning of those words he had heard from the cross in San Damiano: "Go and rebuild my church, which, as you can see, is falling into ruins." Well, what happened in 1208 and the development of the Order of the Friars Minor will be the focus of my next talk. See you tomorrow.